We all know the stereotype. Catherine of Aragon, Henry VIII's older, discarded wife. But the Spanish princess tells a story in a way we haven't quite seen before. The real question is which parts are history and which parts are pure TV fantasy. Let's go through season 2 and see. So, the first invention. The show presents Catherine of Aragon as a brave warrior in armour who fights on the battlefield while her husband is in France. But this is just as much of a made-up story as the image of her mother Isabella of Castile in armour on the battlefield. Catherine really was a regent and ruled the country at the time, which without a doubt shows us how much Henry respected her in the early years of their marriage. She was given sweeping powers to raise troops, to make ecclesiastical appointments, to pick sheriffs, to issue warrants for the payment of money, and generally to use her sign manual, or signature, to set the machinery of government in motion. Henceforward, until the king's return, her signature, Catharina the Quene, would have as much force as Henry R. Mere queen consort no more, she was now like her mother, co-sovereign of the lion's share of her husband's dominions. Catherine did, in fact, leave the safety of London, and headed north toward the Anglo-Scottish border, taking with her 1,500 suits of armour. One contemporary, Peter Martyr, reported that the Queen, in imitation of her mother Isabella, regaled her reserve army with a speech compelling them to defend their territory. And remember that English courage excelled that of all other nations. But Catherine was not on the battlefield under any circumstances, and she certainly wasn't riding there on a horse. She was in Buckingham, about 60 miles north of London, when she received the news of the victory. Historian David Starkey writes about this period in Catherine's life. Catherine's war regency was the climacteric of her life. I think the show was so eager to present Catherine as a strong and fearless woman that it invented this horse and armour storyline. But courage and intelligence can be shown in other ways. Now, Bessie Blounts' childbirth. The series turned Catherine of Aragon not only into a warrior queen, but also into a midwife queen, delivering the child of Bessie Blount, her husband's mistress. This is, of course, completely absurd. First of all, her childbirth took place far from the court. It was kept secret and organised by Cardinal Wolsey. The birth of the child was surrounded by so much secrecy that there are even disputes about whether the date of June 15th is correct. After the birth, the baby was taken away from Bessie and placed in a noble household with wet nurses, tutors, and servants who would raise him. This was standard practice for elite children in Tudor England. They certainly didn't walk around the court like a happy second family in front of Catherine. Sometime later, she married and stepped away from court life completely. The king made sure she was provided for with land and continued sending lavish New Year's presents. So yes, the drama in the series is exaggerated, but it still does not take away from how unusual and upsetting the whole situation must have been for Catherine. David Starkey writes that Catherine was in brutal shock when the illegitimate son received so many titles, and she truly feared for Mary's future. He also writes that Henry had dismissed from the court 3 of Catherine's Spanish ladies, whom he believed were encouraging her displeasure. The biggest lie of the series is how it portrayed Catherine of Aragon as a mother, as if she didn't love Mary at all because she wasn't a boy, and ignored her just like Henry did. That is an outrageous lie. First of all, the falsehood starts right from Mary's birth. Yes, everyone expected a boy, but Henry did not ignore her arrival. Both parents were quite optimistic. That famous phrase, "We are both young. If it was a daughter this time, by the grace of God, the sons will follow," was not about Elizabeth's birth by Anne Boleyn, but about Mary's birth in 1516. Henry said this to the Venetian ambassador after Mary's birth. A daughter was not always considered a negative thing in Tudor culture, as many believed that if a woman bore a daughter, a son would follow soon after. Both Catherine and Henry were happy at the birth of a healthy child, since before that they had gone through several tragic pregnancies and births. Henry, though a bad husband as we know, was actually a wonderful father to Mary in her childhood. He proudly showed her to ambassadors at court. The king usually called her the greatest pearl in the kingdom and said, "This child never cries." Mary also resembled her father physically. She had a fair complexion, pale blue eyes, reddish or golden hair, and a rosy face, which she definitely inherited from Henry. In the series, Rosa, the former lady-in-waiting, tells Catherine that Mary needs to be given an education. Excuse me? Catherine of Aragon was the daughter of Isabella of Castile, one of the most powerful queens in history. Catherine grew up with respect for female rule. She absolutely saw Mary as a potential future queen and would have made sure she had an education worthy of a monarch. Much of her early education was planned by her mother, who consulted the Spanish humanist Juan Luis Vives and commissioned him to write De Institutione Feminae Christianae, a treatise on the education of girls. In July 1520, when Mary was 4.5, she entertained the French delegation by playing the virginals. By the age of 9, Mary could read and write in Latin. She studied French, Spanish, music, dance, and possibly Greek. The real Catherine of Aragon was not indifferent. She was deeply devoted to her daughter and loved her immensely. When Mary was ill, David Starkey writes, "Catherine would take her into her own bed to care for her of any other person but myself to nurse her. I will put her in my own bed where I sleep and will sit up with her when needful." Which, as you can imagine at the time, was unheard of. I think the real drama in Mary's life was that at some point she went from being her parents' beloved little girl to being isolated from her mother and forgotten by her father. That trauma stayed with her for the rest of her life. Henry VIII cruelly separated mother and daughter, and Mary never saw Catherine again, even after her death in January 1536. And the last point, which is more subjective, I didn't like that. In the series, the actors barely changed visually, even though we are talking about a time span of more than 20 years. Neither Henry nor especially Catherine looks like they're in their 40s. At the start of their divorce, and his affair with Annabel and Catherine was 41 or 42. The actress does not look that age, even with red lipstick. And by the way, Catherine of Aragon gained weight with age. I'm not saying this to body shame her, but because it is part of her story. It was the result of many pregnancies and difficult childbirths. Her body changed because she went through a lot. King Francis, though, said about her, he, King Henry, has an old deformed wife, while he himself is young and handsome. Venetian ambassador Giustiniani was also not very kind. She is rather ugly than otherwise. So if the series had shown this part, it would have added emotional depth to her story. Probably, Catherine avoided public ceremonies in the later years of her marriage so that she wouldn't be compared to her still quite handsome husband. Around that time, she also began leaning more toward everything Spanish and became even more religious. I think the show failed to capture this inner drama she undoubtedly experienced. Catherine of Aragon, in the words of historian John Edwards, Henry VIII's greatest queen. And when you know her story, it's hard to argue with it. Do you think the show succeeded in telling her story and revealing her true self? I'll say it again. Shows like this are fine to watch in the evening with a glass of wine if you've got nothing else to do. But don't take any of it as the truth. Which series should I break down next? Share your thoughts in the comments.